Should we start?
I'm not ready.
Okay. We've heard that this is a somber, serious crowd, and so you're going to be very disappointed this evening. First of all, Aarti, I want to start just generally asking you to describe your book.
Sure. So first of all, I just want to say it is great to be here. I wasn't familiar with Traverse City, and then when I mentioned to friends I was coming here, there was a lot of envy. There was a lot of, oh my God, book tour's not hard. What are you talking about? I'm very happy to be here. It seems to be a beautiful place. Now, if you've heard me, on the radio or through your smart speakers before, I like to call myself Indian IT lady. So, I'm delivering the news on Google, on Facebook, on big tech, and important news, how does artificial intelligence evolve? How are disinformation campaigns disrupting democracy? But what I decided to do, this is my first book, here we are, American Dreams, American Nightmares, was I stepped back in time and felt I needed to share my family's immigrant story. Okay, in a nutshell, my parents were uprooted as small children when the British left the Indian subcontinent. They were among the millions of people displaced through a war really, called the partition. They migrated around the world effectively stateless. They met in Morocco, married, had 3 children. I was the last, an accident. And then they decided to come to Queens to cross the Atlantic. We came on tourist visas. We overstayed our visas. We were undocumented for a few years. It was a hard time. I recall more than once, we lived in a really crappy apartment in an awesome neighborhood, but a crappy apartment, just, everything broken, no heat in the winter, that kind of thing. I recall waking up more than once with a roach crawling up my leg, that kind of situation. Then we got our papers through a process that is called and derided as chain migration. It has always struck me that term is a beautiful term. The way I think about it is every family member is a link on that chain, and the more links you add, the longer, the stronger the chain is. And last I checked, we want strong families in this country. But that's how perverse the conversation has become around the fact of our existence. We get our green cards. We think we are now on the straight shot to the American dream. Everything's going to be awesome. Okay, not. Things were going well for quite a while because I was now part of the formal, sector of society. I became a scholarship kid at a very fancy private school in Manhattan. The cost of going to that school was, in today's terms, a Tesla a year. While at that school, I learned amazing vocabulary that I had never, ever heard before, like the term country house. Concept blew my mind. Yes. A country house, for those of you who don't know what it is a house that is your second home. I didn't know that there were people that wealthy. My dad, meanwhile, was building his American dream. My father was a brilliant man. He spoke 6 languages from his world travels. He's on the low end of globalization, as many migrants are. Very scrappy, very smart. He also multiplied very large numbers in his head. When we first got to the US, Dad shoveled snow for $4 an hour. That's the best he could find. It shocked him because you hear from the other migrants that America is this land of opportunity and promise, and there's a kind of filtering that goes on because you don't want to cross the Atlantic and then tell your family, I made a mistake and it's really hard. So just the positive stories go back out, right? Anyway, Dad managed to open his own store, his own small business, on the very same street where he used to shovel. Huge accomplishment. And his store was bigger than some of the people who employed him. It was awesome. Not huge, 2 stories as opposed to 1, that kind of thing. One day we get a call. My father has been arrested. He is at Rikers Island. And New York State is charging him and his little brother, my uncle who helped run the store, with selling watches and calculators to the wrong guys, to members of the Cali drug cartel. The way it sounds on paper, it sounds like what the state is saying is my family's business is really just a narco trafficking front. It's terrifying. I was a kid who wanted to be a prosecutor. I was having a hard enough time accepting who my parents were in the halls of my elite private school, dealing with my own imposter syndrome and shame. Having my father in Rikers Island was not a point of pride. It was not a point of indignation. Oh, the justice system, it was just shame. Long story short, New York State, the prosecutors say, offer a plea deal. And our defense lawyers, we'd hired private defenders, said, Mr. Shahani and Mr. Shahani, here's the deal. No one in this court really thinks you're a drug front. And meanwhile, my father had been saying, we sell watches and calculators to anyone who will buy them. That's what we do. But Mr. Shahani and Mr. Shahani, take a plea, 8-month sentence. You get it over with. Because if you go to trial, there is a trial penalty. That's not written into the Constitution, by the way. That's just how the law is practiced. Trial penalty means you go to trial, and if you get convicted, instead of 8 months, you get 10 years, 12 years, 15 years. Well, shopkeepers don't have that kind of resource. They can't take that kind of risk. And the justice system is not about innocence and guilt. It is about risk and reward. So what did my dad do? What did my uncle do? They do what everybody in that system does. They plead. Well, the 8-month sentence ended up spiraling into a 14-year legal battle that destroyed my father's life, ended in the automatic exile of my uncle, and singularly defined my life, hanging over me until I was 30 years old. So that's the story that I write. And I decided that I needed to tell you that story because we are in a moment where our nation of immigrants needs to hear from real immigrants. We all are, by the way, most of us are. But many of us are disconnected from our own family stories, and I'm not. So I'm sharing it with you.
Please, please. I want to go back
I'll be quicker on other answers, by the way.
No, no. We have 6 hours, so
Okay, perfect.
lots of time. You lay it on out
that
there.
happens in political meetings. I used to be an organizer before I was a journalist, and like the meeting, it was like 3 to 4, and then by 8 p.m. you're like, anyway.
So I want to go back to your time in Queens.
Yeah.
When we were having dinner, one of the things I said was, when I read the jacket of the book, I instantly had this kinship with you because you said Queens was this sort of place that you wanted everyone to see so they had a better understanding of America. And I feel the same way about Detroit. So for you, what is it about Queens that makes you feel that way?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So here's the funny thing. I mean, I described to you a little bit about, like, you know, the crap apartment we lived in. And a funny anecdote about that, part of writing the memoir was revisiting certain places because, you know, memory is also emotion and vice versa. So stepping in and what do I remember? And I have to say, I go to my old building in Flushing. It's the end of the 7 train. If you've ever been, for example, to a tennis game in Queens, my stop was the one after that stop. Go to my old building. You know, it smells a little better, not much better. And I go to the mailroom, and, you know, we were there in the 1980s, okay? Apartment 401, Shahani. It's like, you guys who run this place, you suck. Anyway, here's what I love about where I grew up. I grew up in a working class United Nations, okay? Our neighbors were every nationality you could imagine. Some Eastern European, some second or third or fourth generation Italian or Irish American, a lot of people from Asia, Africa, Latin America, spoke so many different languages. Because of where I grew up, I became incredibly comfortable with difference, even seeking it, needing it. And that's actually the American identity on hyperdrive, okay? This country, this is the tricky thing because it is our responsibility to critique what is wrong, to be aware of the racism, the tribalism, the nativism flaring up where it does, at the very top as well as the very bottom. We have to vigilantly watch out for that and know that it's not right. But there's a danger of missing the forest for the trees. Compared to most countries on Earth, the US actually does pretty well when it comes to absorbing difference and diversity. What I mean by that, my parents really marveled at this. They were uprooted as children in the partition, as I'd mentioned to you, because Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims were literally roasting each other's babies on skewers, literally setting whole train cars on fire so they would come into a station with every body burned. I don't know the kinds of blood that my parents saw when they were little because it was too much. My mom didn't have the memory. She was too young. For my father, there was a lot he couldn't talk about, which I get into in the book as well. But for those people, our people, to be at war in the ways that we were so brutally back home, and in Flushing, Queens, apartment 401 neighbors sharing milk and sugar and food and babysitting each other's kids. That is powerful. It's incredibly powerful. The way that back home, you know, it's funny, even like look at interracial marriage, which happened, like that's every marriage in Flushing. You know, people fall in love with their neighbor, whatever. You know, back home, it's not like, oh, in India, it's okay to marry an Indian. They have to be your ethnic group. They have to be your caste. The question is, well, does their family eat garlic or not? Like, these are real questions that people ask before they'll let their child enter into another family. The US is remarkable at fusion. And my hometown, and it sounds like yours as well, really encapsulates what makes this country unique, what is actually in the DNA of this country.
Thank you for that answer. I want to ask you one more question about the apartment in Queens. You and your sister.
Oh, I really wanted you to bring this up, okay?
Used to play with orange chalk that you got from, I believe, a Chinese grocer, and then it got outlawed. Tell us a little bit about the orange chalk and what it means to you now.
Oh, okay. Actually, I thought you were going to go somewhere else, but I'll tell you about that, sure. So yeah, I mean, there was this basically, you know, we had so many roaches. I mean, the roaches were out of control, and we'd try anything to kill them. And Mom, you know, who's an incredibly resilient lady. I mean, she was raising the 3 kids, you know, along with Dad, but she as a woman typically took up a lot more of the work at home. She was working as a seamstress. She was babysitting other people's kids. And she could be a little bit mindless in certain ways. So there was this orange chalk that got banned because it was poison not just for the roaches, but for humans. So Mom would go to the vendors on Main Street, and she'd because she had a box left, NYPD outlawed it. And so, of course, what happens when you outlaw something, it doesn't disappear, it just goes underground, okay? That's how real life works. So Mom took her little box, and she'd go pleadingly to the vendors, please, I need this for my family, I need this for my family. And they'd trust that she wasn't a police officer undercover. They'd sell her the orange chalk for probably 2 or 3x the price now. That's what happens. And then Mom would come home and put it in me and my sister's hands, our tiny little hands, and be like, go play, girls. And so we would basically run around the house and chalk up poison for the roaches and us. That was my upbringing. And actually, there's one other thing Mom did. This is a parenting tip you should feel free to share, because I think it's brilliant, is there were 5 of us living in a 1-bedroom apartment, 1-bathroom apartment. And Mom was busy, and we only had 1 toilet. And so my sister and I told you I was an accident. She's only 14 months older than me. You know, she's a little bit bigger than me, not much. So when we were little, Mom would put Ange and me on the toilet at the same time, back to back. And we would both have to do number 1 and number 2. and we couldn't leave the toilet until both were done and we could confirm it and then call mom. And because my mom was sewing in the one bedroom which she turned into her sweatshop dress factory, she would just have to come to wipe us once. So it was efficiency and it was teaching patience. It's awesome parenting.
I was going to say, how is your relationship with your sister?
So we reacted to the physical intimacy really differently. I crave it constantly, and she doesn't want to hug me. Yeah.
So let's move ahead just a little bit. One of the things I think you started to get a better understanding of how the world works, the role of race in the world, the role of fairness in the world, was when you got a scholarship to go to a high school in Manhattan. Tell us a little bit about that high school, and then I'll have a follow-up.
Okay. Yeah, so this high school, it's funny because I grew up in working class United Nations Queens, where I saw every nationality, fewer white people in my building certainly, and in my public school. I got to Brearley, the Brearley School, and I had never seen so many white bodies apart from TV. I just hadn't seen it before. It blew my mind. And I remember, it's interesting because, children's reactions, and adults as well, I just think that children are allowed to be more honest about it than adults are allowed to be. It's very visceral, this is where I also worry about, I think it needs to be safe for us to talk about the discomfort that we feel, because get real, we all feel it. That's different from saying it's okay to be a horrible human being to someone else. It's a pretty bright line distinction. But I got there, and I was totally struck by the racial divide. I remember that they didn't really know what to make of me because they were used to white kids and then a few black kids on scholarship. The Asian was a much less known quantity. And so I think in some ways that made me invisible or in the background to observe a lot of what was going on. Sorry, did you want to say something? And it's interesting because my school, the prep school, when I first got there, even though I was struck by the racial difference, what I really identified with was a building full of empowered girls. Because I grew up in a household where the expectation for me from my father, from my uncle, even from my big brother, from my cousins was, girls go in the kitchen and help their mothers make the meals. Men never set foot in that kitchen. So when you come home, even if you have homework to do, whatever, you make sure you get your actual duties done before you try this school thing. That was the message I got at home. At Brearley, I was like, I learned, girls rule the world. It was amazing. I was like, my people, not my people, but kind of my people. And what I will say, though, is that, and that's still very much how I feel about that place, even like on book tour on the East Coast, each stop on the East Coast has had friends, and not even friends, like people from my high school class who I didn't even ever talk to because I didn't feel comfortable around, showing up to book tour and because they're interested women, and they've been from a very young age. Now, all that said, I remember really wanting to think of my prep school as utopia because it wasn't my patriarchal home. And then as time passed, and I remember I have this scene in the book. It's junior year, and it's time to elect class presidents for the next year. And we do co-presidents, not just one, but a co-president system. And 2 black girls decided to run. These 2 black girls, star academically, star community service and community engagement, stars athletically, one incredibly extroverted and everyone's best friend, the other kind of introverted and nerdy. I thought they were like the perfect, one was a scholarship kid, kind of like me, the other was from a wealthier family. I was like, oh my God, they represent everything at Brearley, old and new, the haves and have-nots, the very scholarly, the very charismatic. I was like, they're the perfect team. And wow, was there a white backlash. And I remember being a junior and being completely baffled by suddenly this sort of tribalism flare up. And a handful of white students deciding they were going to run a team against the black students, and the kind of things that I heard in the process. So it's just funny because I feel like so much of my childhood was searching for utopia and just not finding it and being overly disappointed at the fact it didn't exist.
So that experience, how did that change you?
Well, that experience was happening alongside the other experience of my life, which was that my father had been arrested, and my main extracurricular became watching him slowly decay, watching my mom vomit every day, and going to court for hearings. So I think that part of what I was seeing at my school was reflecting part of what I was seeing in the real world and at home.
Yeah, I was going to say, I felt like while these two paths were sort of parallel, going on at the same time, it did leave an indelible mark on you that some of your experiences later you could see. Let me ask you about your father at this point.
Sure.
I think it would be hard for just about anybody in here to really have an understanding of what you went through, what your father went through when he was arrested. But that's a lot of what this book is about.
Yeah.
Tell us what happened.
You know, I can share a little bit, and then whenever it's the right moment, I'd love to read a scene that's very directly answering that question as well. So when my father was arrested, I mentioned to you he was taken to Rikers Island, as was my uncle. I grew up wanting to be a prosecutor because that was my sense of how you could achieve justice, put away the bad guys. I grew up with a lot of crime around me. And going to Rikers Island, that first visit, remains today the most important lesson I've had about the truth about America to this day, particularly the truth about the nightmare in America. We go to Rikers, and that sense of like, what are we doing here? I can't believe this is going on. Dad, what the hell have you gotten yourself into? And I had in my mind a lot of blame and anger towards him. What have you done, Dad? But when we got to that visitation room, and I saw all the other people, it was kind of like a big gymnasium with metal chairs and tables set up. I got to that visitation room with my mom and my brother to visit Dad in his orange jumpsuit, and I look around me, and everybody in that enormous room was a person of color. And for all the rage I had toward him, I couldn't help but think, where are the white criminals?
We're still waiting for that answer.
And that's the thing. We call the book, it's Here We Are, American Dreams, American Nightmares. Here we are is a statement of fact. Whatever you want to try to do at the border, we are coming, we are here. This is the DNA of this country. The American Dreams, American Nightmares is basically my thesis about this country, which is that it is a duality, and the duality exists down to a single family. The life I have in this country, the magic doors, the secret doors that have opened for me that I never knew existed, like going to Brearley, being a scholarship kid there, that was just like my public school teacher being like, oh, you seem nerdy, try this thing out. And then wham, into a world of insane privilege, where my own climb from the humble origins that we have, it's just leaps and bounds from an early age. I have lived the dream. There's no doubt that I've lived the dream. I know that. And my father lived the nightmare. And I think that a lot of the nightmare in the US is actually manufactured and created over and over again through the so-called the criminal system that touches a lot of lives, too many lives. Yeah.
Your experience with your father really changed your relationship with him, deepened your relationship with him. you had a visit to Rikers. Do you want to read that passage that really sort
Yeah.
of says something about that?
Yeah. Even in talking so far, I talked about Dad being brilliant, and I obviously have a lot of love and admiration for who he was. He's passed in 2015, but lives in me. And then there was, he was also the guy who got on my nerves. Like, you might have had that dad. You might be that dad. In our particular circumstances, he was the guy who worked 7 days a week, who came home, smoked Marlboros in the corner, didn't know him, didn't really ask questions. And when he talked to me, it was to say, that skirt is too short, that shirt is too tight. That was pretty much our conversation. I didn't like him. And then, as the legal case against him evolved and continued and morphed over the years, from that 8-month sentence to a surprise second punishment, which was a deportation proceeding that would last a decade, I turned toward Dad and I wanted to understand who he was. Not that that was my express goal, but it's what happened in the process of fighting like hell to keep my family in this country together. I talked a little bit about high school. I went to college at the University of Chicago. And when we learned that deportation was going to come after this sentence, and a lot had gone wrong in this case, I detail it in the book, there's just nothing worked the way it was supposed to. It's kind of like regular people make mistakes and we pay dearly. State prosecutors and legal authorities make mistakes and they pay nothing. It is what it is. Anyway, I was by the time when it was time for Dad to serve his 8-month sentence, I was actually already in college by then. And I had this sense that this 8-month sentence was either going to be a life sentence or a death sentence. And the reason I say death sentence is my father's health had gone really south. He'd had a couple of heart attacks and he'd lost all of his teeth. He was a guy in his late 50s who looked like he was in his late 70s. So I stopped going to college because either Dad was going to die at Rikers Island, or right after he was done with the sentence, he was going to be automatically exiled, which was the life sentence. And I needed to be close to him. It wasn't like a spreadsheet decision. It was my body told me, Aarti, go home. You've been doing everything in your power to get out of here. Go home. It's time. And I'm really happy I did that. And part of what happened in not going to school and being back home and fighting and learning about the legal system and that time off and whatnot, it was a very productive time. I got to know my father. And so there's a passage I'll read to you from Here We Are that's about getting to know my father. It's about 5 minutes, okay? All right. It took 3 hours to get to the last checkpoint, the open-air gym with the tiny tables. There was one woman standing in line in front of me, and she had enormous breasts. I could see a third of them heaving from her V-neck. Oh my goodness, I hope I recognize him, she turned back and told me. Huh? I didn't understand. My girlfriend set me up. I can't tell which one he is. You haven't met before? No, but he's going to be out soon. This woman was at Rikers Island on a first date. A blind first date. I wanted to shake her. Girl, I love a captive audience too, but this is taking it too far. Wait till he's out. Good luck, were the words I managed to mouth. A corrections officer pointed to the tiny table where she'd meet her man, no guesswork required, and then pointed me to Dad. You look tired, my doll, he said as we sat down. No, I'm good. Are you eating enough? Yeah, Dad, I'm eating plenty. That question got on my nerves. Mom, who was still vomiting multiple times a day, would ask it to me, and sensing my irritation, she'd latch on, persisting either as Martyr Mom, Aarti, I ask because I'm your mother, or as Infomercial Mom, I have homeopathic pills, try them. Dad had the sense to back off. I gave him the London debrief, ending with how Ange, my big sister, went missing. He laughed a deep laugh. That daughter of his could brighten any day. She was so different from him and me that way, a constant reminder of how good it could be if you just let loose sometimes. A few tables over, an inmate sprung from a steel chair and threw it against the wall. Guards raced over and pinned his face and shoulders down. I thought they were about to call off visitation for everyone. They didn't. They just dragged him away. "You're not where you thought you'd be, huh?" I said to Dad. He shook his head. "No, not at all," he said without saying. The silence lingered for a moment. Conversation didn't come naturally. Inside jail, outside, it always took effort with us. "How'd you learn Arabic?" I decided to try the interview approach. "Did you have books? Tapes?" "No, I learned by attending the customers," he said. "Each day I listened for the important words. Slowly, I picked up very good Arabic." "Important words like what?" "Kaif halikum, barak ala fik, arak lahikan, ana ahabuk habibti." How are you? God bless you. See you. You are my love. That last one stood out. "Who taught you that?" I asked. There's no way Dad's boss taught it to him. "It's a funny thing. You make me go back so many years." He smiled and hesitated for a moment. "It was an Armenian girl. She asked me for a date. She said in Arabic as well as in Armenian, 'Ana abuka,' I love you." "Did you say it back to her?" "I was nervous. I was shocked. I never had a girlfriend. I never went out with anybody. It was strange for me to hear someone say that. But we did go to see a movie. It was In the Heat of the Night." That was the Sidney Poitier film where an African-American detective goes to the Deep South and gets wrongfully arrested for the murder of a white businessman. Dad was a 25-year-old migrant worker out with an Armenian flight attendant watching a movie about American race relations. My first date was Boys in the Hood. I was in 7th grade, out with a Chinese-American boy who won my heart because he could name every highway that crossed through Queens. Neither Dad nor I were allowed to date. I didn't mention these parallels. He continued, "In the theater, I came to know she spoke English too. I didn't know that before. We came out of the theater. We spoke English, French, Arabic. It was nice." I began to imagine what she'd looked like in the dark. If Dad turned to see her profile or just stared straight ahead the whole time. If their fingers or forearms brushed as they strolled the beach after the movie. If they listened to the waves lap, or if she found conversation with him more easily than I did. They met when she came to the tourist trap where he worked. She bought leather sandals and brass vases, little trinkets for family and friends. She came back again and again. Then one day she asked if he had time for coffee. At the time, I didn't have permission. The bosses were strict. On some Sundays, I was allowed to leave. So we went for coffee a few times, but the cinema was just once. "Why not more?" I asked him. "You love movies." "Because I couldn't afford it." She was spending money all the time. I didn't like that. I had limited pocket expenses. I had to think of my family first. When I went back to India, she wrote me a letter. She said, "I'm waiting for you." And she sent me a photo. She told me, "Show to your family." "Did you?" I asked. "Yes, I showed them. My mother, brothers, sisters. They said, 'Who's that girl? Are you taking up the foreign way? Having a girlfriend?'" Dad shrugged. I didn't much bother about it because I knew I wouldn't be able to and also take care of my family. "I see," I began to paraphrase. "Because you knew if you were going to pursue a relationship, you couldn't send as much money back home. So you either could have a girlfriend or be a good son." Yes, that's true. I felt sorry for young Dad and this Armenian romantic who thought love could transcend distance. Dad hadn't answered my question, which I repeated. "Okay, so then did you ever tell her, 'I love you' back?" "No, I didn't say anything." He laughed at himself. "I was nervous and just smiling and putting my head down like a little girl. I'm sorry to say, but a fact is a fact." "Time's up," a guard called out to us. Time never flies with Dad. This was a first. As I boarded the white bus that went to the visitor center, the woman who'd had her blind date slipped into the bench beside me. How'd it go? I felt obligated to ask her. Really well, she smiled ear to ear. We're going to see each other again. That's great, I feigned approval. Yes, I was judging her, though the uncanny resemblance was not lost on me. She was at Rikers, getting to know a stranger. So was I.
One of the things that jumps out at me about that passage, and it actually runs throughout the book in a number of ways, is the way that your father felt this duty to his family, and as he got married and had you kids, continued to feel that duty. You sort of picked up that duty to your father as he was in prison. You became almost a lawyer of sorts, working on things, and you also found out some very interesting and even discouraging things about the legal system during that time. Tell us a little bit about that effort to start to be a de facto lawyer.
Yeah, I actually ended up designing and teaching a curriculum that lawyers got credit for from the Bar Association, too. It was kind of a very wild journey. What happened is that I told you I'd stopped going to college for a while. During that time, I was visiting Dad, I was working to make money, and I was just writing and hustling to everybody who could be able to help us to find help for my father. Because I knew that pretty much deportation was going to be automatic, and it would take some kind of insane miracle to stop it. So I'm like, I'm on the hunt for an insane miracle. I ended up, through an email I sent to, we had a 5-foot television at home, because this was part of our American dream, was like the 5-foot TV. And we hadn't had to sell it yet. It was still at home. And I had seen this immigration lawyer talking about H-1B visas and marital petitions. And I emailed him and I'm like, hi, my family has green cards or we're US citizens. My dad is going to be delegalized because of laws passed in 1996 under President Clinton. That lawyer invited me to come and speak at the New York City Bar Association. And I just kind of thought, New York City Bar, oh, that's just like hundreds of lawyers. I'll go there and they'll fix everything for me. That'll be great. And what actually happened, Jerome, is that I went to the city bar. And this is all before September 11th, hundreds of people in a packed room. And on the panel, the same panel where I was going to eventually speak, was a congressman, Barney Frank, this guy, Bo Cooper, the top prosecutor for the entire immigration agency, a lawyer from NYU, just very high-powered people. Like, one of the people on that panel would decide my father's fate. Regular people don't get to sit that close to power, typically. It doesn't happen. It was a first for me. And in that room, where I eventually also, for the first time, shared my father's story, the legal issues, basically just crying out to the room, can any of you help me? I came to learn that my family was at the forefront of a national crisis, which was that Bill Clinton had signed these laws, these 2 laws, one of them on the anniversary of Timothy McVeigh bombing the Oklahoma City Federal Building. So there was like a vehement anti-immigrant measure on the anniversary of, mass violence perpetrated by a white man. But what I came to learn in that room was, oh, Clinton signed these laws, get tough on immigrants like we get tough on crime, like we get tough on welfare moms. That was the ethos of the 90s. And suddenly all these lawmakers, Republicans and Democrats, are hearing from their constituents because families, including long-term legal permanent residents, are like, holy crap, we're about to be exiled. So what ended up happening is the room I stepped into to find a lawyer for my dad, and I didn't end up finding one in that room, also opened my eyes to the political reality, which was that mass incarceration is a term we now know, and thankfully it's a term that more and more people are critical of. The ethos today is different from the 90s. We're not where we need to be yet, but it is different from the 90s. Mass deportation is a subsequent, related phenomenon. And that's what we were discovering, and that's what we were undergoing. And millions of people since then have been touched by it. But that room catapulted me into an entire career of accidental activism. So, I joke I'm IT lady on NPR, right? That's how I've spent my 30s. I spent my 20s in prisons and jails working with immigrants who were prisoners who were going to be deported and their families. That was all of my 20s. I basically wore sweatpants and a sweatshirt and a ponytail and ran around with a bullhorn. I didn't have a nice microphone. I literally had like a bullhorn and organized ad hoc rallies in front of like the federal building. Yeah.
And at one point, as you were doing this activism, you ran across somebody you had seen before, a certain judge.
Oh. Well, it's actually, I ran into the judge when that chapter was entirely closed, but I'm really happy you're asking me about him. I stayed in activism until I was about 30, burned out horrifically. This book, it's first and foremost, it's a eulogy for my father, because he's one of those people who didn't get to matter. It's a lot of people, and he should have. He didn't die with dignity, and he should have. It's absolutely a love letter to the families I relate to, who I see in my newsfeed now. They are not to me alien invaders. They are not to me whatever the headlines and the politicians call them. They are me and I am them. And I also hope that this book can really touch the young people, because there's this beautiful youth movement sweeping not just this country, but the world. You see the brightness and the intelligence and the passion and the commitment. And I actually wrote specific chapters in this book where I just lay my soul out about burnout and over-identification and hating myself. Because it can be tricky. It can be very tricky when you fight for a cause to over-identify with it. But anyway, I burned out very badly.
Wait, let me ask you about that.
Okay, sure.
Because one of the things I really liked was, well, not liked, but really struck me was when you had this epiphany of what had burned you out. A certain thing had happened, and you were not reacting well to it. Talk a little bit about that.
Oh, sure, yeah. So even though I began fighting for my family before September 11th, the attacks just made more people go through what we were going through. I accidentally started a nonprofit in New York. What I mean by accidentally is I was a kid, and suddenly philanthropists and wealthy people were looking for people like me who were trying to help immigrants. And so literally, money was tossed at me to start something. All right, cool. An actor cut my organization a check, use it how you want. And one thing we decided to do is we were going to fly a bunch of people from New York City to Oakdale, Louisiana. Now, the reason for Oakdale, Louisiana is because the detention system, the immigrant prison system, they can take you from wherever you're from and just toss you to another part of the country. And it's actually a strategy that breaks someone down. It's much harder to fight your case when you're far away. So we had money. We were going to fly people to see their loved ones. And when we get to Oakdale, our contingency from Brooklyn, from Queens, from the Bronx, when we get to Oakdale, we learned that a young man from Brooklyn, he was 34 years old, died on the floor of the prison, was denied any kind of medical care, any kind of CPR. The hospital, which was 5 minutes away, took 45 minutes to send an ambulance when he had collapsed. It was that kind of situation. When I learned about the death of this 34-year-old, my reaction was not mourning or horror or a moment of silence or a tear. It was, how can we use this for a headline? That was my first thought. And I needed to share that, and I'm not proud of that at all. I needed to share that because I know that I really, when I left activism and made my pivot from prisons to Silicon Valley, I really hated the younger me. I hated her. I hated her because I felt like she forced her father to fight a fight he didn't want to fight. I hated her because she pushed and stopped even caring about the people that she was supposedly speaking out for. I just thought she sucked. Now, I can be overly harsh too. It's taken me a bit of therapy, particularly with my Buddhist. I'm Buddhist, and I talk to a Buddhist practitioner leader about this kind of stuff. It's taken me a while to kind of let up. But part of what was to me fascinating about writing the book was I gave myself a kind of creative challenge, like, Aarti, you're carrying a lot of baggage. You're hearing certain emotions incredibly loudly, disproportionately so. So give yourself a little creative exercise. Sit with yourself and think about, what is one of the worst things you did in that time period? Or two of the worst things you did in that time period that just embodies why you dislike her so much. Write it on the page and let it go. And trust that you will not repeat those mistakes in the future. Just forgive yourself for that. And so I actually have two scenes in the book is divided into acts, and the act specifically in my activism was reflecting honestly about the death of a young man and my immediate objectification of it. And the other was reflecting honestly on how I did not want to hear anything my father had to say as I was fighting to keep him here.
How difficult is it to be as honest as you are in this book? In a number of places, you reveal thoughts that you had but did not voice. In a number of places, as you were saying, you look back and you talk about yourself very critically. How hard was it for you to be that honest about yourself?
That part did not feel hard. To me, it was remarkably easier than the script I was reading as when I was fighting to keep my father here. I mean, this is the big difference between me now versus me in my 20s. In my 20s, I was desperately trying to keep my family together. So I didn't have the luxury of going into congressional office. I was mounting a political campaign. We weren't going to win through the courts. We were going to win through a political campaign. I didn't have the luxury of being honest. Because when you're fighting a campaign, you've got to do talking points. You've got to push. You've got to stay on message. I get it. I see people do it. As a journalist, it annoys me when I interview people. I can hear the talking points. I also get it. I respect it. I know where it's coming from. Well, you know what? My family isn't under threat of deportation anymore. I'm now a woman of privilege. And so I would say that I finally got to tell the honest version, and I'd wanted to.
Let's talk about victory. What was victory like?
When the legal matter was finally settled, and I guess for the sake of readers, I'm like, spoiler alert? What? I'm so confused about how to do this. I'll say it at a high level. Yeah, I can do this without.
No, I was going to say, so you didn't win. We'll just say that. There was no victory. How's that?
No, I mean, well, I actually think that that's what I'm questioning in the book. I think that this book was a process of me figuring out, did we actually win or not? Was it actually worth it or not? I needed to figure that out. But what I will say is that there is a moment that is certainly a type of victory. I think that we're talking about the same one. And I remember that moment. I suddenly felt, it's not literally how I felt, but it's emotionally how I felt, like I'd had this open wound and like an invisible hand stopped picking the scab at me. And I was like, wow, I've been on a decade-long anxiety attack. And now that I didn't have to deal with the threat that was always there because it had been resolved, I was like, what do I do with myself now? I literally just felt like I could breathe again. I felt like I could breathe, and I had no idea how much weight I was carrying until it was lifted. And that's a very common feeling. I mean, like when you're going through trauma, when you're going through pain, if it lasts long enough, you forget what normal feels like. And then once you have normal back, you don't even know what to do with it. And that was me up until I was 30. You'd asked me about that judge, and it's actually reminding me, if you don't mind me. Once I was in my 30s and living my fancy life. Actually, it wasn't true. What really happened is I hit 30, and, I was tired of being an immigrant daughter, and I had crap credit. Like, my credit score was so bad, I was terrified. And I just wanted to rebuild it. I wanted to live a practical life, not a passionate life. I'm like, passion is overrated. Give me something practical and steady, please. And I raced into journalism because relative to everything I had been doing, it just felt like an incredibly safe place. And it's a funny thing to say because a lot of people go into journalism for passion, but for me it was a kind of different entry point, business journalism specifically. Anyway, because I'm on NPR, all sorts of people who would never have given me the time of day before suddenly give me the time of day. On LinkedIn, I get a message from the guy who ran Rikers Island. He's like, oh, Rikers Island, the jail where my father was. We have mutual friends. He's like, next time you're in New York, let's grab some coffee. He's a brilliant, multidimensional, interesting man. He's not actually what you would expect as the top jailer of the most notorious jail in the country. We get together, quaint little cafe on the Upper East Side. From the conversation and previous conversations we've had, he knows I'm interested in criminal justice even though I report on tech, and he's wondering why. My dad was a prisoner at Rikers. Oh, that's interesting. Didn't know that. He asked me about the case, the judge's name. Tell him, Joel Blumenfeld. Oh, is that right? He's my very best friend. We go back to the Vietnam War days. You want to meet him? And I read this, he's like, he made it sound like a Tinder date. I was like, what? Swipe. So I didn't know why I said yes, but I said yes. And this is when I was just getting my foothold in NPR. I had just been hired as an actual employee for my beat, and I was feeling my security and whatnot. It's just starting to happen. Anyway, the judge, via email, invites me to come visit him in his private chambers in Queens. Wow, I have no idea why, but sure, I'll go meet this guy. I go during a business trip, walk into Queens Courthouse. I'm having these sort of flashbacks, like memory is physical, these flashbacks to certain things. Anyway, I go to his chambers. First words out of his mouth. Before I sit down, before anything, first words out of his mouth, young lady, your father and uncle should never have taken that guilty plea. What a mistake. And I remember feeling like my spirit had left my body. I wanted to collapse. I went over to the sofa, I sat down. He talked. I vaguely remember what we talked about. Now, I'm a journalist. It's my job to ask questions and gather information. If I were there on assignment, I would have been like, fascinating, tell me more. As a daughter. And so we weren't talking about some random case. We were talking about my father and our livelihood. And that judge had no clue what happened to us after he hit that gavel. He had no clue. So it was horrifically painful to sit there. As soon as I could find my way out of those chambers, I got out, and then the tears flooded. Just like ugly crying, like really ugly crying. Weeping all the way home. Never told my father about that conversation. Couldn't bring myself to, because I didn't want him to hurt the way that I hurt. But that was, Jerome, a lesson also in trauma, because it took me a while, and it was iterative, for me to realize how much that chapter actually hurt and defined me, in certain ways broke me. It took me a while. And knowing, like, that judge's visit, that happened, and it took me, I think it was 3 years before I had the wherewithal, the stamina, the desire to go back to him and actually do a sit-down interview to dissect what he really meant, which is also in the book.
So I think I just have 3 more questions for you, and then we're going to throw it out to the audience to ask you a few questions. Throughout the book, your dad calls you Dal.
Yeah, dal.
And
Dal.
and he says ha before. I want you to say it the way he says it.
Ha, my dal.
What
I
does
try
that
it now?
phrase? What does that phrase mean to you?
Ha, it's just,
I mean, here. What does it mean here?
I will tell you I am a crier. That should have been on the poster, like as a disclaimer or something. You know, it's, we write eulogies to resurrect people when they're gone. So it's funny because when writing about, like, I didn't expect that I was going to try to capture so much of his voice in the writing. Like, I didn't know that the story would have so much dialogue, and that these little things about, he called me Dal, my Dal, also my Pichkari, which means the little one, the baby, in one of the languages he spoke, Sindhi, our ethnic language. Mom and Dad, they called each other Daling, which is darling, but with their accent. And it was funny because they would, you know, sometimes, every once in a while, it would be a sweet, my darling, but usually it was, darling! And it just, I guess, you know, it, like I'm getting emotional now, it made me emotional. Like, I have never cried so much as I've cried writing this book. I can't recall being 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever little age. I can never recall crying as much as in this process. And thankfully, I don't mind it. I'm not afraid of my emotions, you know, and I appreciate the applause and the strength from you guys. I think it's really good. This is how, to me, it's kind of like when you sweat when you exercise, you cry when you write, or sometimes, but it's a way to metabolize what's inside. Yeah. But, you know, it's just, I needed to resurrect him. Yeah.
Now you're going to make me cry.
I just told you it's okay, you can.
I guess just really the last question. After reading this book and getting to know your family so well, I feel like we could hang out with them through this book. I still can't figure out whether you are, after all these experiences, an optimist or a pessimist. Which is it?
I'm a curmudgeonly, kind of contrarian optimist.
All right, we'll take that. We'll take that. We're going to give you an opportunity to ask a few questions from the audience. There are a couple of microphones or a microphone roaming around.
Thank you so much, Aarti, for sharing your story with us tonight. It's been a wonderful conversation with both of you, and we very much appreciate it. I think with all of what's going on with immigration and a lot of things that we hear about the border between Mexico and the United States, what would your wish be for immigration in the United States? And what are the things that you think we should know to advocate with our elected officials for?
Well, thank you for asking that. And so here's the thing is that there is so much that is broken at a policy level. Here, I don't think that that's the most helpful thing to expound on. I do want people to note that the legal regime that gets used by certain administrations in really vicious ways was created under Clinton. And it was sweeping. I mean, like the mass deportation that exists today is because of him. That's a fact. I actually, earlier this week, it's been such a weird week, guys. My book released on Tuesday, and Tuesday morning, I was doing a live radio hit. I was on Point for NPR doing a live show. And right in the studio next to me was Hillary Rodham Clinton and Chelsea Clinton doing an interview on their book, Gutsy Women. So we're done with the interviews. We're in the atrium. A small crowd has formed around Mrs. Clinton because they want to take pictures with her. I'm standing there because I feel I need to tell her something. And this is, again, I am totally one of those people who plans to say something to someone without having any idea what they're going to say. I just know that I have to say something, and whatever's going to come out is going to come out. And I'm sure that, like, plenty of you identify. So I go up to her, and then her handler is like, oh, would you like a picture? And I was like, yeah, I'd love a picture. And then she takes a picture. I say, congratulations on your book. I just wrote my first book. And she's like, oh, that's fabulous. What's the title? Like, it's called Here We Are, American Dreams, American Nightmares. She's like, oh, what's it about? Oh, it's about the decade-long deportation case I fought to keep my father in this country after your husband signed a couple of bills. Now, I am not saying, and it is not correct, to hold a woman responsible for the misdeeds of her husband. That was not my message. But it was a message from my family to her family. Now, to zoom out a little bit, the thing that I think we all need to do right now is the crisis that we face in the U.S. is the crisis and the hope. They come together. And this is why I say the contrarian optimist. The crisis and the hope is that, on the one hand, the laws have gotten worse and worse and worse. This whole, like, this sort of saying about, like, why don't they just stand online? I'm like, what line are you talking about? What line that any bureaucrat is processing is there to stand on? Like, I know how my family got our green cards through a petition from a U.S. citizen relative. Right now, that same petition, minimum would be 23 years to process. And that's having a citizen relative. Imagine if you don't have one. Forget it. There's nothing. So the laws, and then how they're stripping people of legal status, how they're not letting, I actually just went down to the border before starting my book tour because I wanted to just wanted to be there and I identify with the people there. I see them and I see my family. So I just, as storytellers, as journalists, as writers, what we're really doing is we're bearing witness. That's what we're doing. And, at the border, basically, women and children is mostly women and children, okay? They're coming in. They're not allowed to come in to cross. So they have tents set up along the Rio Grande on the Mexican side of Matamoros. Volunteer lawyers are coming in from Brownsville, Texas, walking over the footbridge to try to help people process their asylum applications, to put in applications, because they're fleeing war. And you've got, in stench, there's no running water, there's porta potties, there's babies, it's disgusting how it smells. You've got these women in open air, stinky encampments, recounting how they'd been raped to their lawyer. That's what the private intake looks like now. Okay. That is the law. That is what justice looks like. Now, here's my hope. It's the culture. These families are alive because volunteers are with hand trucks going with food, water, and diapers every day. Okay. The lawyers who are volunteers are determined to get those applications done. These are all Americans. And so we unfortunately, and immigration is not the only place where this is true, we unfortunately have a situation where political leaders are misguided. They cast stones. They set up standards that their own families never met. But we have a culture where we feel it our duty to welcome the newcomer, and quickly. I met a little boy there. I'd asked if I could volunteer there, and all volunteering really means is, can I please get in your way so I can learn something? So there was this little boy there. So a lot of people from around the entire world are coming in through the southern border. So there's a father and son from Angola, okay, who are coming in through the southern border. There are Indians coming in, there are Chinese coming in, everyone's coming in through the southern border. So this little boy was separated from his father for 15 months. He's 11 years old, 15 months he was not with his father. They've just been reunited. They're now living in a Catholic shelter with these sisters who are running it. The sisters asked me if I could help teach the boy English. He already speaks a few languages. He picked up Spanish during the border. Like, he's nearly fluent in Spanish, and he wasn't before he became a migrant. It's kind of hilarious. I'm like, wow. And my Spanish is decent, so we spoke mostly in that language. But I was teaching him English also. And he takes my smartphone. He wanted to play with my phone, and he wanted to do okay, I taught him the word selfie. It started with me. Because I thought he should know what that word meant. And then he's like playing with the camera, and then the video, and then he wanted to make a video. And so I hit the record button, and what does he want to do? He wants to sing me a song. What's the song? God Bless America. He knows most of the lyrics. He knows the refrain very well. And I'm watching that, and I'm like, in 15 years, maybe even in 10 years, maybe as soon as 7 years, this chapter will be a sad memory in his past as he is going to college in this country. You would never know what he carried. But he will be among us. He will go to school with your children. He will do great. And then, if he is really blessed, he'll have the fortitude to remember what his own family went through and remind everyone else for the next newcomer, right? Yeah.
Please. But before we take this next question, I want you to relax. I know that you're very shy and reserved.
Oh, trembling.
So go ahead.
Your story really touched my heart and
Thank
touched
you.
it very deeply.
Thank you.
And kudos to my friend Ann and Doug for giving us this opportunity to hear your story.
Oh, thank you.
And I know what I'm going to be doing the rest of the night, reading your book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I'm especially interested in
Like,
reading
please
the
take
part.
me home.
Oh, Did she come? No. I'm especially interested to find out how it felt to be surrounded by faces that look unlike yours. I wonder how that felt. But my real question is, understanding how much you suffered, what drew you to Buddhism?
Those are two great questions. I think the faces unlike mine, I have to say again, going back to my working class United Nations upbringing, even when I find things bizarre, like I write very vividly about the sea of white bodies at Burley. I think I called it a tsunami of white bodies at Burley. Even when things are bizarre and they strike me, I think fundamentally I feel open to difference because I grew up with it. And I'm not particularly like politically correct or anything. Like, I'll say that things look awkward or weird to me, but I'm cool with it. And I actually, you didn't ask this, but I try to make the point that working class multi-ethnic training is the kind of training every parent should want for their children, because that's actually the future. I mean, like, I know the incredibly wealthy people in Silicon Valley who are paying big bucks to make sure their kids are fluent in Spanish and Chinese, Mandarin. And it's like, you could have just lived in my neighborhood. Buddhism, and I don't actually talk too often about this. So if anyone is a practitioner or a scholar, forgive me. I actually first practiced meditation when I was 3. My mother, when we got to Flushing, Mom did not want to be around Indians. There were plenty of Indians, but she wanted to escape them. And I actually write about that, how for her, the story of how America is liberation for women in particular is really underappreciated, because this country is so much better for women than a lot of the places we come from. When Mom got here, she loved everything that was not Indian, and she avoided her own. She didn't know that until I pointed it out to her when I was writing the book and interviewing her. But one of the things she did is she went religion hopping, because we Hindus love all religions. So we joined a Christian cult that my mom is still a part of, and my godfather is from there, and so we're part of a Christian cult, Unification Church. They did the mass wedding, Sun Myung Moon. They helped to feed us when we didn't have food. We also went to a Korean Zen feminist Buddhist temple. And for whatever reason, starting at age 3, I enjoyed sitting quietly. Now, activism, my decade of activism, was a very loud, frenetic, hypercharged, full of people kind of thing. And when I left for California, I think, and I was having a lot of anxiety attacks. Like I remember in California, like I do the tech beat, and I would tell my boss, like, oh yeah, I woke up at 4:30 or 5, and I just try to play it off like I'm just a type A workaholic. I wake up super early, and I can't wait to get started. I'll keep East Coast hours. I'm on the West Coast. I was waking up because I was having anxiety attacks. Like I was waking up, staring at the ceiling for 2 hours at a time, cradling myself, and not knowing what was going wrong. And I got reintroduced to Buddhism really through a friend of mine who was going to a regular sit. And that became a structured place to sit with myself. And in the company of others, it became less of an anxiety attack, and it became a mechanism for the practice of self-awareness. And so I can't explain too much what that means, but I would just say that particularly, I think everyone can benefit from quiet. And I think that when you allow quiet into your life, how clearly you can see. Like it's the best analogy I can give is like literally we're all walking around with a pair of sunglasses or shades that's tinted. Blue, green, yellow, like brown, whatever. Like you have these colored lenses on, but you don't even know you're wearing them. And then when you sit and you practice, you start to recognize that, oh, I'm seeing things this way because I have this bias over my eyes. So, that was a huge part of my healing, calming down from the anxiety and working through it. But then I would even say finding a really deep, solid core in me so that I could be as vulnerable as I was on these pages. Yeah.
Up in the balcony?
Hello, Aarti. Thank you for coming to Traverse City.
Thank you.
I have 2 questions for you. You've mentioned 2 times now that the law that created the problems for all the immigrants was signed by Mr. Clinton. Why did he sign it?
There were a few reasons, and there are actually 2 different laws. One of them was attached to an omnibus bill that he didn't want to veto in totality. So there was a sort of political maneuvering going on. But that said, when you look at what Clinton was actually saying, Bill Clinton was actually saying at the time, he was talking about the criminal illegal alien problem. The 90s was a time where the discussion about crime and the need to police it and to look at constituencies through that lens was really dominant. And so it's not like he said when he was signing, hey, I really think this is terrible, but there's this omnibus bill we need. He literally gave a speech talking about, he said incorrectly, I believe it was around the second of the bills, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. I believe it was that one in the signing of it. He had said that this bill is meant to take care of the problem of illegal immigration and will not harm legal residents. And to me, what was just so funny about that is just like, dude, like this bill specifically strips green card holders of protections more than any other thing that's passed in this country. So, you know, I think he didn't pay attention to what he was doing. And part of why I would say that it was really sloppy on his part is so instantly after he passed those bills. I mean, like, I got involved in activism in 99 and 2000. In 99 and 2000, you had Republicans and Democrats doing sign-on letters and sending them to Janet Reno saying, oh, we've got to repeal some of this stuff. It was sloppy. Unfortunately, that bipartisan campaign pretty much evaporated after 9/11.
So my second question brings us to today, and I'm full of despair. I think the biggest problem we have today with the tribalism that we have and the hate of the two parties between each other is because we have too much information out there. 30, 40 years ago, you had 5 stations where you got your news from. Today, and you had talked about that you report on disinformation. Do you see any glimmer of hope?
You know how I see it, and I appreciate you bringing that up. I don't see it as a problem of too much information so much as a problem of too little community. So, you know, and maybe that'll speak to people here. We're not connected to each other. We don't see each other. I can tell you, I do reporting, okay, on the white extremists who have done mass shootings in the last couple of years. And when there's an internet angle to them, the internet angle is they're lonely, sad guys sitting at home alone in internet chat rooms, talking to people they don't even know, being fed information that is conspiracy theory nonsense, and then running the how-to on get a weapon and live stream it on Facebook. But that's not an information, I mean, to me, that's kind of like, we live in an incredibly lonely place. People suffer from loneliness. I mean, there's depression, there's like, I think that so much, you know, if the next book I write, and maybe it won't even happen in that form. Like I have a friend who's actually writing a book that I hope really makes a wave in this, is that we need to be willing to do the work of seeing each other. So it is not coincidental or incidental that you and I can't see your eyes so clearly. I have actually good vision. I can see them somewhat. And lovely sweater, by the way. I love leopard print. I wrote this book. The timing of it was in part, I was ready because my credit score was good and I felt confident again. But the other part of it was I wanted to see my country, and I wanted my country to see me. And I think that if we can let ourselves be connected, have rage, sure, but make yourself seek out connection, and then a world opens.
Another question? We'll wait for the microphone to get around to you.
On a little more personal note, I'm just curious, did your siblings have similar opportunities to you, and how did they fare through all of this?
Yeah. Among my siblings, my brother, sister, and I were very close to each other. We've lived somewhat different lives. My brother is 10 years older than me, so he didn't get to be the baby. He was, by age 12, my surrogate father. He had a very different life from mine. My father and I, ultimately, I believe we were best friends. My brother, it wasn't the same for him. He felt that my father leaned on him too heavily. As the eldest son, he sacrificed a lot. And he felt that it cut off certain opportunities for him, and I think that's right. I think that that's true. Thankfully, we're still incredibly close, and I think that we have a deep empathy for each other and a wanting to be there and support each other. But he had it really hard. My brother had it really hard. I don't think I had it like he had it. My sister, who's a year older than me, I think has more similar to my experiences. That said, all 3 of us went to great colleges. All 3 of us became professionals. All 3 of us are homeowners. I mean, all 3 of us are living the dream, you know?
Let me ask a quick follow-up to that in a different way. Tell us a little bit about, if it's still current, your roommate?
Yeah, I have a roommate. So, my roommate is my 20-year-old nephew, my brother's first son. I will not at this juncture get into the backstory. It's in the book.
It's good.
I don't tend to see the world in terms of villains and heroes. Like, I think everyone's pretty gray. But to the extent that my book has villains, because, the deportation system, it was a bureaucracy. It was cold. It wasn't a villain. It was just this cold machine that churned. The villain, to the extent that there are villains, were our own. The people from our own ethnic community, whom my father in particular really wanted to trust, because I think that for my father, he had endured so much change and so much instability and the rug constantly being pulled out from under him in life. He had the worst reflexes. He just thought, oh, I can trust this guy because he was my countryman back before partition, or I can trust this guy because we landed as refugees in the same place. And those were bad decisions. So there is in this book some incredibly deep betrayal, but it's not from who you would have thought.
I think we have time for one more question.
How do you believe our immigration system should work?
Yeah. So I want to give you, in broad brushstrokes, the vision around it, but I'm not like I've actually seen Elizabeth Warren, for example, and like, whoa, she is a wonk. That's not my role, that's not my voice. But I do have clarity around the direction. There should be lines to stand on, like real lines. They should actually exist. It should matter if you already have family here, that you too can adjust your status. How long you've gotten to live in this country should make a difference. I'm thinking specifically right now about the dreamers. Okay. I see them, they are me. If we came now, the subheading of my book would have just been American Nightmares, not American Dreams. So I think there has to be ways for people to actually become American. And I think that the reason that's really important, so I think that fundamentally we have to have an ethos, a legal structure that, like our culture, is more open. I mean, we're a land of fusion. Why is America the global leader of entertainment? Because we are the globe. Okay? That's who we actually are. Why is it wherever you go on this continent or on this country, you open Google Maps and you search for restaurants and you get 15 ethnicities? Doesn't matter what corner you're in. You could be in Farm Belt, whatever. If there's restaurants, they're all, they're from everywhere. So I think that fundamental openness, as opposed to a mindset of we're full, find the next place, because that like small, limited mindset is actually, I believe, morally wrong. And also, and this is not my primary argument, but I can certainly make it vigorously, profoundly unstrategic.
So we'll take this moment to say, please, a warm round of applause for Aarti Shahani.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. This is beautiful. I'm going to take a picture. This is really...
Thank you, Jerome, too. Thank you,
very
Jerome.
Cool. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.